This program is made possible by a grant from the University City Committee for Access and Local Origination Programming from a fund established in cooperation with Charter Communications Incorporated.
Of the more than 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, over 1.5 million were young children. Yet, there were thousands who escaped certain death at the hands of the Nazis. I am one of those children, and you will meet two others, Jerry and Marie, and learn about their stories and their experiences. Hitler came to power as Chancellor of Germany in 1933. 10 years earlier, he had written Mein Kampf, a book that clearly stated his anti-Semitic views, and he also made it clear that his mission was to get rid of all the Jews in Germany. As the years passed, he expanded this mission to get all of Europe rid of their Jews, and that was his initiative. His first conquest was Austria, which is actually the country he was born in, and he annexed it to Germany in 1938. I was 6 weeks old when he marched into Vienna. He was welcomed by the populace, and my parents, who were Austrian-born Jews, were frightened, but they believed that their neighbors would protect them. In November of that year, on Kristallnacht, which is the night of broken glass, Jewish stores and synagogues were ransacked and burned, and the Austrian and German citizens joined Hitler's army in all of this destruction. Parents were desperate to save their families. They gave up their homes and their businesses, all their belongings, their families, and sometimes even their lives. We are the children who were somehow rescued from certain death, Jerry, Marie, and I. We all have our own stories to tell, and we come from different countries, and we were saved in different ways. But there are many things that we have in common due to our survival experiences. By the end of 1938, my family had already been humiliated and arrested, and my cousin, who was 10 years my senior and was no longer allowed to go to school. My father realized that we had to flee before it was too late. Fortunately, we were able to get away because my family had enough money and my father had enough guts to bribe enough Nazi officials to get the required documents to leave. We booked passage on the Italian liner, the Augustus, and headed for Montevideo, Uruguay. The reason we went to Uruguay was because they let us in when other countries had closed their borders to us. And since my father and mother had always come from a family that had made their living in the food business, they believed that they could survive anywhere because people always have to eat. Now, in the early 40s, Hitler's army swept across the European continent. They created ghettos to imprison Jews. They built concentration camps, labor camps, where Jews were worked as slaves, and then the death camps where millions of Jews were murdered. The young and the elderly faced certain and immediate death. Jerry, your parents were living a comfortable life in Poland where 10% of the population was Jewish.
That's correct.
There were almost 3.5 million Jews in Poland, and your father was a successful businessman who owned properties and farms. And what happened to your family?
Well, when Nazi Germany attacked Poland September of 1939 and occupied the area that we lived in, the Nazi rules went into effect almost immediately. And some of the things that were initiated originally were not really life-threatening, but very humiliating. But in our part of Poland, it was a white armband with a blue Star of David on it, and was worn on your right sleeve, and that immediately identified you, who you were.
And what did that mean?
Well, what it meant, for example, that if you were walking down the street on the sidewalk and you encountered a German soldier, you were not allowed to remain on the sidewalk, but had to step off onto the pavement, bow down, and once he passed, you were allowed to get back on the sidewalk. The other thing that went into effect almost immediately was rationing of food. Those were the beginnings. And of course, this went on for a little while, and then later on, a ghetto was formed. We were told to assemble in front of our buildings and carted off to Warsaw, the Warsaw Ghetto. All you could take with you were just a small suitcase. And what do you take? So you take valuables, things that will retain their value. If people had gold coins or foreign currency such as dollars, jewelry, those were things that would retain their value and were small. Starvation was certainly going on. Sanitary conditions were almost non-existent, and everybody knew that if, since the rations were so ridiculously small, that if you had to rely entirely on those rations, that starvation was your future.
So there was a black market.
There definitely was a black market. Young boys, 8, 10, 12 years old, were agile enough to go over the wall into the Aryan area, and possibly by stealing or trading or bartering for maybe a few carrots, maybe a few potatoes or a loaf of bread, would bring it over the wall into the ghetto.
How old were you at this time?
And this was, I was about 12 years old.
So were you old enough to go over the wall?
Well, I was old enough, but I never did. And to this day, I kind of carry a guilt complex about it, because I certainly should have gone to try to help out the family, but the penalty for doing it, if you got caught, was being shot right at the wall as a warning to others. So either because my parents never asked me to, or because I never had the courage to do it on my own, I never did. But the whole point is that when you're risking your life to bring food into the ghetto area, to sell it on the black market, obviously the price that people would have to pay was exorbitant. And it was obvious that we were going to run out of our financial resources.
Mm-hmm. So what did your dad work out for you?
Well, first of all, I have to go back just a little bit and tell you what my parents were involved in during the good times. Some of the properties that they had was a farm. And there was a small town very close to that farm. And Dad would make several trips a year to that area, and by doing so, he actually met quite a few families. And one of the families that he met were the Zilbermans. When we were in the Warsaw Ghetto, my dad and Mr. Zilberman corresponded with each other. Mr. Zilberman encouraged my dad to try to escape. And he said, if you can make it out of that hellhole of Warsaw Ghetto, come to us, to this town of Kosów, and we'll share our house with you, and all you'll have to do is help us out with our farming chores. So Dad took it to heart and found an individual he was making his living by smuggling people. So if you had sufficient funds to be able to bribe the necessary people, he would provide the means for us to get out. And the means were a streetcar line that traversed the ghetto area, and by knowing the conductor and knowing the motorman and knowing the policeman, the family in 2 shifts was able to actually escape on that streetcar line.
Mm-hmm.
So the armbands came off at the right time, and all of a sudden we're on the other side and made it out of there.
Was that you and your brother? You had a brother?
My brother, who's 3 years younger than I am, and my mom and dad, and at that time my paternal grandfather lived with us. He was a widower and he lived with us. So the 5 of us actually made it out of the Warsaw Ghetto on that streetcar.
And you went to the
To the town of Kosów, right.
Yeah. Because they weren't bothering the Jews in the small rural areas yet?
No, that wasn't really the case. We later on found out why Kosów was being treated totally differently than the people in the Warsaw Ghetto. There was no ghetto in Kosów. Approximately, the population was divided half and half. Half was Catholic and half was Jewish.
Really?
And the thing in common was the fact that they were all making their living on a farm. Whether they were Jewish or Catholic, the means of supporting yourself was by farming.
Mm-hmm.
So the Zilbermans had a small farm, and they had a cow and a horse and sheep and so on. And they were buying and selling grain and, of course, farming their fields. So
they were more important to the Nazis left alone than they would have been if they had destroyed their farms?
I don't think that that was really the cause for treating the people in Kosów differently than in other places. Later on, we found out that we were so close to an extermination camp, to a death camp. As we all know, once the decision was made to form death camps, that there were 6 of those, which are not to be confused with concentration camps. Those were in Europe by the thousands. The death camps were located in Poland, and there were 6 of those. And of course the largest one was Auschwitz. The next in size and the number of people that were put to death was Treblinka. And Treblinka happened to be approximately 4 or 5 miles away from the town of Kosów, where we were now, and about 4 or 5 miles from my dad's farm. So number one thing that happened was that the mail that we used to get from the rest of the family who remained in the Warsaw Ghetto stopped coming. And we started getting reports from people who supposedly were telling us that they were loaded onto cattle cars in Warsaw and sent east. In the beginning, people thought that they were being, or were told that they were being sent to farms, Russian farms.
Marie, you were also in Poland at this time, and how old were you?
I was not quite 5 years old when it began. I was born in October 34, and Hitler attacked Poland in 39. And I remember also being in a ghetto, in the Warsaw Ghetto, and I remember the way I escaped from there. My uncle later told me that I was one of those children to whom if you said you can't do it, I proved that I could. And so he arranged with me to meet him at a house and crawl underneath a barbed wire fence and meet me there. And he said, "No, you can't do it." And I said, "Well, I could and I would." And so I did crawl out from under that fence, and no sooner was I on my way to this meeting place with my uncle than a German Gestapo was there with a huge German Shepherd. And I happened to have always loved dogs, so I went right up to that dog and I made friends with him. And this German says, "You just came from this place, didn't you?" And I said, No, I was walking and I saw your dog." And my uncle tells me that he was shaking in his boots at the time because he was so afraid that I would say the wrong thing. And I really feel that that policeman had to know that I crawled from under that fence. But being that I was so brave and went up to his German Shepherd, I guess he forgave me. And then I met my uncle, and he bandaged up my entire face, and the streets that he was taking me through to a hiding place, he would tape my entire face and have me say, "Oh, Jesus, my teeth are hurting me." And I guess this was his his way of disguising my face from looking so Jewish. And he took me to this terrible, terrible wet cellar somewhere and left me there, and he said he would come by as soon as he could. Well, that seemed like an eternity to me, and to add to my fear, there were mice all over the floor, and I was afraid they were going to get to my toes, and so I found a chair or some kind of a stool and stood on top of it, and that allowed me to see the children playing outdoors, and of course I was interested in them. However, someone saw me, and that person was extremely afraid of letting me remain. So somehow she got a hold of my uncle, and he had to drag me out of there and take me to another place. My mother was going to take me to my grandmother, my daddy's mother, because they had more food. And so she took me there, and I have this clear picture in front of my eyes where she kneeled down with tears streaming down her face, and she said goodbye to me. And I never saw my mother again. And what I was told later, that as she was trying to return to the apartment, she was caught.
Oh, my.
And what they did with her, we never were able.
Was that in Warsaw?
That was in Warsaw. And at that point, my daddy decided that we had to get out of Warsaw. And so he went to a small town in Opoczno. And he was lucky enough to get a job as a hair cutter there. And as he was working there, a Polish man who was some kind of a sheriff in Germany, he came back to Poland to recruit workers for this farm in Germany. And he happened to walk into this place where my father was cutting hair. And evidently they must have had a meeting of the minds or some soul understanding between each other, because my daddy confessed to him that we were Jewish, and he said, "If you could take my daughter with you on the farm, just as soon as I can leave, I will come there." And he gave him whatever money or possessions that he had, and indeed this man did take me with him. And all I knew was that half an hour before I was leaving, that my daddy told me my name no longer was Vatnicka, but it was Polak, and never ever was I to tell anyone that I was Jewish, ever. And
you were 5 years old.
I was, by then I may have been 5 already. And that I was going to go with this man, and my daddy would meet us as soon as he could. Finally, we arrived at nighttime at this Polish man's farm and home, And as his wife opened the door, she didn't even say, "Who is that?" but she said, "What is that?" And I never forgot that thing, and she took an instant dislike to me.
So what happened to you on this farm? What was your life like?
Well, good, it wasn't. I had never seen a cow but in my baby books, and suddenly I needed to milk cows. And they are so huge when you are little, and of course you don't know what you're doing either, so instead of collecting the milk into the bucket, it went all over the place.
How long were you there?
I was
with this
there
child?
from middle of 40 until 45, when
For 5 years.
for 5 years.
And you worked on the farm?
On the farm, and I remember having to do diapers in that waterfall where you pump the cold water, and doing dishes, and going out to plant vegetables and bringing in potatoes and corn and whatever needed to be done on the farm. Somehow I was supposed to be doing that. And a humorous part is that I was supposed to watch this one chicken because she tended to lay the eggs anywhere and everywhere but where she was supposed to. And no matter how I watched that chicken, she outsmarted me every time. And so then I was accused of either stealing those eggs or eating them or selling them, and it was drummed into me that yes, you did, and yes, you are guilty, that even though I knew I didn't do that, I admitted that yes, I did steal those eggs. And one day, as the family was going to church, in a ravine there were about 20 eggs.
Oh, my.
And so then she knew that I truly was not lying. I was just guilty of not knowing or following the chicken. And so from that I learned that, okay, when I was telling the truth, I was guilty, then from then on I was going to be bad. And I did steal from that then on, because she wouldn't feed me and she would beat me. And I went to church and I had to learn all the prayers, none of which of course I knew. And I had to go to confessions and to communion. And I remember confessing to the priest everything that I stole and that I lied, except that what my name was and that I was Jewish.
Mm-hmm. So you kept that secret.
And I kept that secret. And during that time, my daddy corresponded with this family and with me. And this lady always asked me to write in a letter to my daddy, asking for cigarettes and asking for all sorts of supplies. And I guess I knew that my daddy didn't have those things, and I didn't want to ask him for any of it. So I was kind of clever, and I would tear that letter up and write another one to him and not ask for anything, just tell him that I couldn't wait for him to get here and why wasn't he coming. And then in 1943, I no longer heard from my father anymore.
Mm.
And later, through my uncle, who was in Auschwitz at this time, I found out that my daddy knew that this Polish man for whom he was working in the barber shop was going to go to the Gestapo and inform on him that he was a Jew, and he no longer had anything to give him. And so this is what happened, that my daddy didn't allow himself to be taken, that he took one of those blades and killed himself with it.
Oh my goodness.
But during this time, he kept writing to his brother, my uncle, who was in Auschwitz, and they had devised some kind of a secret code between the two of them of my whereabouts, because this Polish family, even though he was an overseer of this farm, we were moving around to different places. And so my uncle told me later that my daddy said to him that if he were to survive Auschwitz, his first obligation would be to find me. And those letters somehow survived, and they were at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C.
Oh, my.
And one time when I was there, they gave those letters to me, which I have, and with the codes that the two brothers devised between each other. And so then it was 1945, and my uncle was liberated from Auschwitz, and he had this guilt hanging over him that he needed to find me. And the last he knew of us is that we were in Germany. So he traveled from Poland to Germany, and he tells me he walked in mud up to his knees from village to village, inquiring about this Polish family, only to have arrived at this destination and learned that the family went to Poland, and that they took me with them. And so from Poland, he went to Germany and then back to Poland. And he told me that he was so fearful that I wouldn't know who he was, because I had not seen him since 39, and this was 45. And that's another very clear picture that I have. I stood by a window braiding my hair, and he walked by, and I instantly knew that he was my uncle. And it was just such a joy. And he tried to negotiate with this Polish family to release me to him.
But they had plans for you.
They had plans for me, that I had become a good worker on the farm at that point. And they had a son who I also had to teach him. And I would tell him that 2 and 2 was 4, and ask him 2 minutes later, and he didn't know the answer. And I thought, oh, what a stupid guy he was. And they always said that I would have to marry him. And that was the last thing on earth that I wanted. And so I made myself feel better by consoling myself that when the priest said to me, "Do you take this man of your free will?" I was going to say no. But luckily it never came to that point. And so my uncle negotiated with them to release me to him, and they of course would not do that. And they said, well, we should be compensated for it because we kept her and hid her for all of these years. And my uncle said, well, I'll be glad to as soon as I am able to. Right now there is nothing that I can do. I'm going to go to our home in Warsaw and see whether I could get any of our possessions. And this man would not have, he would not be, what's the word? He wouldn't cooperate or even consider doing that.
You were too valuable to them.
Obviously. So my uncle on another visit said, tonight go to bed dressed in all of your clothes, and when everyone is asleep and it's quiet, again you have to meet me at this place, and I bet you can't do that. So that was another challenge. So I did go to sleep with all of my clothing, and when the house was quiet, I ran out and I met my uncle. And he took me on this train. I don't know where we were going. And he told me my manners were atrocious. I didn't eat with a fork and a knife. I didn't speak correctly. And that's my education started. We arrived in Germany. This must have been either end of 45 or 46. And my uncle had an apartment for us. And he was working, and his wife by then was working as well, but it was very difficult to keep the two of us, my little cousin and I. So they put us in an orphanage. And my uncle always came to visit when he was able to, and each time he came, he would give me some 50 cents or a quarter or whatever. I saved that money and bought a certain dress that I just loved, and I had the dress hanging in a closet. And at one point, we had a representative of a kibbutz come from Israel to Germany and tell us what life would be like in Israel once we got there. And they were extremely religious group, where we had to say a prayer for the potatoes and a different prayer for the meat and a different prayer for the vegetables. And on Saturdays we couldn't brush our teeth or make the bed. And one of the young ladies was wearing that dress that I had saved for and bought and hadn't even worn. And so I said to her, "Did I give you permission to wear my dress?" And she says, "No, but you see, when you get to Israel, we are going to live in a type of a kibbutz where no one owns anything. What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine, and this is what our life would be like." And I, at that point, had been turned off religion. I did not feel that there was a God to pray for, to, or say prayers for all of these different things. I had seen rabbis murdered just like a worse criminal. I saw babies being torn out of their mother's arms and shot. And I thought to myself, there can't be a God to allow all of these things to be happening. And I wasn't going to go to such a religious community at all. So the very next day found me on the doorstep of the social worker. And I said, "I am not going to Israel. I don't want to be religious, and I don't want to live such a life."
And how old are you at this
This
time?
was about 46. So I was born in 34, so I was about 12. So at that tender age of 12, I decided that my life was going to take a different course and that I wanted to come to America. And the social worker said, "You were ready to go to Israel on a transport within 2 or 3 months, but coming to the United States, you might have to wait for years and years." And I said, "Okay, I will wait for years and years." I had to wait to come to America till 1950.
Well, Marie, listening to your story of survival through the war certainly makes me realize how fortunate I was to be in South America with my family. And Jerry, I'd like to hear your account of how your family survived when things started getting really, really dire for Jews everywhere in Poland, even in the town where you were. How did you manage not to be killed?
Once my dad was convinced that the town of Kosovo was going to be eliminated as well, he decided that the only way to survive was to go into hiding. And of course that's a lot easier said than done, because everybody knew what the penalty for aiding Jews was. You were just shot right along with them. So there was not very many people that were willing to take the risk for any reason. So he didn't know that many people in this town of Kosovo, but met up with a couple of young Jewish men and said to them, "Look, you know a lot of people around here. See if you can come up with somebody who would be willing to take that risk," and found a family. The family, the name was Jan Gural and his wife, the couple and their son, who was married, and 3 young daughters, teenagers, lived on this little farmhouse. And that was the family that decided to take the risk. So the plan was that we call it bunker, you can call it shelter, would be dug in the barn. There were 2 barns on their property. In that second one is where the location of the bunker was decided on. We had 11 people in hiding. And if all 11 of us lied down next to each other on the floor, that's all the room there was. So it takes approximately 24 feet to accomplish that. The width of it was just about 6 feet, because one of those brothers was a tall fellow, and when he stretched out, he went from wall to wall, and about 4.5 feet high. The amazing thing is that even to dig out a pit like this, the amount of dirt that has to be moved is tremendous. And somehow or another, these men were able to do it all in secrecy, because you could not let anybody, any of your neighbors know what you were doing, what you were involved in. So it was all done at night, and bucketfuls of that dirt had to be taken out into the fields and spread so that nobody would become suspicious as to what kind of activity is going on. The young teenage girls were the ones who were bringing us food once a day. It could be 10 o'clock in the morning or 10 o'clock at night, or not at all. It all depended on what the activity in the barnyard was like at that time. Usually consisted of a big pot of soup and a loaf of bread, which was divided then in the bunker among the 11 people. The toilet facilities were the adjacent chicken coop that was under the same roof as the barn, so you had to come out through the trap door and walk the full length of the barn to the other end to use a bathroom with the chickens. You had to be careful that you didn't scare the birds, because that could give you away too. And of course, the only time you could use the bathroom, let me call it that, was when there was no activity. So the worst of times for us was really harvest time, because that's when the neighbors tended to help each other. You help me today, I'll help you tomorrow. And the barn itself would become a beehive of activity. So those were really very tough times for us.
So how did you pass the time?
One big activity that we were involved in was waiting for food. You were sitting there in anticipation when this food was going to arrive. The other part of the activity was searching your clothing for lice and lice eggs. So that took up a lot of time. Also, the farmer, Mr. Gura, would make a daily trek to the town of Kossuth to pick up get a shot of vodka and pick up a newspaper. And so we had a daily paper in the bunker, which of course was read from front to back several times over. And it was really nothing more than German propaganda, but it was written in Polish language, and you kind of had to read between the lines as to what was happening in the world. So we were maybe a little bit better informed about what was going on than people who were in concentration camps. They really didn't have any source of news.
And you were there for almost 2 years.
Not quite, 20 months.
20 months.
20 months,
That's
right.
long enough.
We went in at the time when the Battle of Stalingrad was taking place. By this time, we felt that really the only hope, the only place that liberation could come from was from the Soviet army.
So how did you find out that it was over?
By, of course, our only contact with the outside world was the Gurad family, the teenagers who were bringing us the food, and the newspaper that Mr. Gurad was bringing us. And Mr. Gurel, one day, of course, we were listening to, reading the news and listening to the sounds of the battlefield that were coming closer and closer. It was obvious, that Germany was going to lose the war. But a few things happened, really, Liz, that we didn't know if those 11 people in the bunker were going to be alive to see that day. The front lines were getting closer and closer, and there were news from the Western Front, battles in Africa, and the landing on Sicily, and the landing in France by the Americans. And one day, the Russians came, and we were free to go.
So did you go back home?
We went back to our farm because our home, being a suburb of Warsaw, was not liberated till about 6 months later. So we had to wait till that area got freed. And then, of course, went home because what you wanted to find out, who else from the family survived, and that would be, of course, the meeting point. And unfortunately, the bulk of our family was murdered.
So how did you get to the United States?
Dad applied for a visa to the United States. That's where Dad wanted to go. And it took several years for it to happen. My brother and I pursued our studies because during the war we really, well, first of all, I have to back up and say that what happened in Poland was that a year later, after the war, there were pogroms, and the one that is really well known in history of the Jewish population in Poland was Kielce, which happened in 1946, and 43 survivors in that town. Mind you, this is 46. War ended in 45. Were murdered by the local population. And at that time, Dad felt that really that there was no future for us in Poland, that we had to leave. So similar situation as yours. Maybe we were on the same train, I don't know. But we went to Czechoslovakia in 1946 and smuggled across the border illegally again. And then to Austria, and then to the American zone of occupation in Germany. And that's when Dad applied for visa to the United States. Brother and I went to school. Took long enough for me to get an engineering degree in Munich. And finally, in 1951, we got a visa to the United States. We were sponsored by a community, Jewish community in Davenport, Iowa. Not knowing us, we didn't know anybody there. They just simply wanted to do something nice for a refugee family. So they sponsored us. And fortunately, when we came, we never had to fall back on their generosity because we did okay. Everybody went to work, and I went in the Army.
Oh, that's an interesting story. You went into the military, and you came here. How did you get here? On what kind of a ship?
It was a Liberty ship that was operated by the Merchant Marine. And one of the crew members was Jewish. And at that time, I couldn't speak a word of English, of course. But I picked up quite a bit of Yiddish when we were in this bunker, hiding out. And he spoke a little bit of Yiddish. So he sort of took me under his wing, and I think the voyage took about 10 days to get to New York. So we landed in New York, and I said goodbye to him. And then when I was drafted during the Korean War, and because of the language ability, they decided that really I would be more useful to the United States Army in Europe than I would be in Korea. very few of us got selected to go to Europe. I was being shipped back now to Germany again. And so now I'm in uniform and with a rifle and duffel bag, and what ship am I getting on? The same ship that brought us over. And the member of the crew, the Jewish member of the crew, is still there. And using a few words of profanity, he said, "What in the world are you doing here? I just brought you over. Why are you going back?" But anyway, so that's, I guess, the story you were thinking about.
Yes, that's an interesting story. Talk about coming full circle.
Yeah. So in my life, I spent probably too many years in Germany.
Interesting.
First, they came to us for a visit, and then we came for a visit to Germany, and then back as member of the occupational force in Germany.
Now, did you come on a ship to the United States?
I was lucky that I flew to the United States. Each teenager was responsible for a little younger child, and I remember that that little girl was able to eat her food and my food, and I was constantly in the bathroom the entire 30 hours. I remember we stopped in Newfoundland for refueling, and then we also landed in New York City, and I remained in New York for a month in an orphanage again.
You were alone?
Again,
No
always,
family.
I have always been alone, and to this day that is one of the burdens that I bear. And I remember in the orphanage, each of us was given $10 for some reason, and I, not knowing the difference between $1 or a quarter or 50 cents, I took my entire $10 and went to a cherry stand, and the guy gave me enough cherries for $10, and I sat there and I ate every last one, and then I was ill forever after. And then after being in New York for about a month, there was a family in St. Louis who wanted to give their home to a foreign person who happened to be me, and so I came to St. Louis in 1950. And when, because I was 15, I was the age of 9th grade, I went to junior high school.
And was that in University City?
That was in University
So
City.
you came to University City. That was the first place that you actually lived and made a home.
That's
in the
right.
United States.
Yes, and then I went to U City High School, and in between that time I met my husband, and we will be married 55 years this October.
Oh, really?
And we have 3 daughters and 3 grandchildren, and has a happy ending.
That's wonderful. And you came to University City a little later, after you lived in out west.
We lived in the city. I lived with my parents. We moved from Davenport, Iowa to St. Louis. Dad had a grocery store on St. Louis Avenue. And then I got married, and we bought a house, and it was in University City.
Mm-hmm.
So from 1957 till 1967, I lived in University City, and then the house got too small.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we moved to the county.
Well, it took me a much longer time to get to University City than it took the two of you, because I was in South America, then I was in Richmond, Virginia, then I married a man from Chicago, then I lived in Springfield, and then out east to Connecticut, and that's where I found out that I was actually a Midwesterner, and came to St. Louis and University City. So it's interesting that all the different paths that we have taken, and all the different places that we have been, and all the experiences that we've had, somehow all 3 of us at some point ended up in University City.
That's right.
So I would like to ask one last question, that with all the things that you have experienced and seen, if you were able to make a statement to young people or to the next generation, or summarize your learnings and what you would like to tell the world, what would it be?
Well, in my case, I would say that extremism is to be avoided, because extremism of any kind turns ugly. In Nazi-occupied Europe, it turned to murder, state-sponsored murder of people. Nowadays, we have religious extremism that is allowing people to terrorize others, to suicide bomb, to murder without any real cause. And I think that really avoiding extremist ideas, extreme ideas, is the warning that I would like to give to the young people. Doesn't lead to anything good.
But you've managed to make a good life for yourself and be a good, productive citizen, parent, husband.
Life in the United States has been great. I love this country and would do anything for it. And it was good to me. Unfortunately, my first marriage ended up in divorce, but I was lucky to find somebody who has given me a very happy home.
And you have
and
children?
we have been, I have children, and she has children. We have grandchildren. I have 2 girls. She has a son and a daughter. And life is good.
That's wonderful. What about you,
Thank you.
Marie? What would you like to say?
Well, perhaps I could add to what Jerry has said, that we have to be tolerant of each other, and we have to be educated, because it seems that if something is different than we are fearful. And once we get to know the other people, then we find we are so much alike, and we need to treat others the way we would like to be treated, and then we would have a better world.
Thank you. And I think that one of the messages that I would like to leave is that even people who have lived through the worst circumstances can somehow survive and make a good life for themselves and for others. And I think that is a real testament to the human spirit and to the fact that we as Jews continue, and that we still can leave a wonderful legacy to the world. I was born in Austria, and I have always missed my family. Growing up in South America, I did have my parents with me, and I had a brother, an aunt, an uncle, and a cousin, but I knew that I needed more than that. When I came to America, I heard my friends talking about other kids in the Jewish community who were related to them. I always envied them. I thought it would be so great to have people scattered around the city who were my family. It seemed to me that it bestowed some special legitimacy to be connected as family to people around you. My mother and father were each one of 7 kids, and almost all of them had gotten married. I heard my mother talk about uncles and aunts and cousins who grew up with them in Europe and were now missing from our lives. Where was everybody? What happened? What happened was the Holocaust. People were snatched out of their lives, and many were murdered. Those who survived were strewn about and in no situation to start a family in their precarious situations. As a result, I didn't have the cousins I was meant to have, and I felt the emptiness in my soul. When I went on a vacation to Florida, I saw my first banyan tree. This tree sprouts roots that look like fronds hanging down from its branches. When these fronds reach the ground, they dig in, form roots, and eventually become new trunks that get thicker and stronger, and then send out their own branches that will again send down new growth. This tree can grow to take up acres of land. Most of the banyans I saw were much smaller. Their growth had been controlled by humans who cut off the fronds before they could reach the ground and set down roots and become trunks. When this was described to me, I remember fighting back tears and feeling a deep grief well up inside of me. This tree was the perfect metaphor for what had happened to my family and to so many other Jewish families in Europe. Hitler had cut us down and deprived us of our destiny. The banyan tree was like a monument to my missing family, and I continue to hold a special affection for it. I am so grateful that I was able to send down my own root fronds, and that they all took hold and continued to sprout more fronds, who are now growing to be strong trunks, and that I have been fortunate enough to witness this growth. I'm the only person in my family who has been so blessed, and not a day goes by that I don't appreciate this miracle. My children and grandchildren are my personal revenge and victory. All of us who survived and produced children after the Holocaust have the same feelings. We treasure our families because they are proof that we will endure as a people.
This program is made possible by a grant from the University City Committee for Access and Local Origination Programming from a fund established in cooperation with Charter Communications, Incorporated.